Hello, this is Professor Robert Henry, and you are listening to The Crossing Ball again. In this episode, we're going to look at a debate between TJump, Tom Jump, and versus Dr. Egner. So what we're going to be looking at here is their discussion on materialism. So Dr. Egner is arguing against materialism, or the idea that all of reality is nothing but matter or material stuff, and TJump's going to be arguing for that statement or that claim that, or for the idea that reality is nothing but stuff that exhibits certain qualities that we would uncover in scientific analysis through empirical analysis. So here we're going to look at some points. I think TJump. Well, we'll get into some of TJump's views and some of Dr. Egner's views. We did an analysis of Dr. Egner's debate with Matt Dillahunty. Now we're going to look at TJump and his arguments with him. So let's take a look, and then later we're going to look actually at TJump, also discussing issues with Bernardo Kastrup, and we're going to see what that kind of looks like. Kastrup's view on materialism with respects to another philosopher, Graham Oppie. So let's get into this right here. Dr. Egner is going to be pointing out some facts about intentionality. Let's listen.
Intentionality is the concept that was championed by Franz Brentano, who was a 19th century German philosopher, who pointed out that the fundamental characteristic of mental states that they're intentional, which means that they're about things, whereas material things are never about intrinsically, they're just what they are. And mental states being about things have a characteristic that physical states never have. The physical state by itself never refers to anything else, it's only itself. So the very cornerstone of what the mind is, which is intentionality, the capacity for aboutness, transcends matter and is not material. The third reason that I'm a dualistic or even idealistic, although dualistic is my own viewpoint, and reject a materialistic view of the mind, is the reality of free will. We clearly have free will. Human beings, that's a part of our toolkit. Denying it is, I think, just bizarre, and it's even self-refuting. That is, if we are wholly determined by our physical nature, by the chemical processes in our brain, by our environment, then we're meat robots, and meat robots don't really warrant being paid attention to in debates. That is, if what we're saying simply sort of accretions of physical processes going on inside our brains, we have no reason to ascribe truth to those processes.
Okay, so right here, basically what Dr. Egner's doing, he's pointing out that intentionality via Franz Brentano, which was kind of like the godfather of phenomenology, and that was ultimately championed by Husserl and others like Heidegger, recognized in physical states or psychical states that are distinguished from material events. So you have these psychical states, or these states of thought, which are distinguished from material events. Ultimately, what Dr. Egner is demonstrating is that materiality cannot address this intentionality, but can only address the constrained properties indicative of matter itself. He says that physical states refer to nothing. They only act in accordance with quantitative laws of mundane causation. So Dr. Egner is pointing out that reality, as we experience it, have these qualities that cannot be reduced to material states. Now, what TJump's going to argue is that he's going to define materiality as any sort of he's going to define it as the base foundation for reality, and what we'll find is that his definition of it is just going to constantly change based on what science or observation tells us about the world, which would be that intentional states do there's something about materiality that can cause intentional states in an emergent way, that they can emerge from these complex relationships that material objects have, namely neurons, and the way neurons interact and the relationship that they establish with each other, that these things, these psychical states, will emerge. Now, Dr. Egner obviously points this out, and we'll see a little bit more about that. But let's hear what TJump has to say about his view on materialism. So.
Dualism or idealism. It's just saying, oh, here are things materialism can't explain. Like, okay, that doesn't mean that dualism or idealism can explain them. Essentially, again, even if we accepted that those three things are things materialism couldn't explain, I think they can explain all of them just fine. That wouldn't be evidence of a new thing. It would just be things that we can't explain yet. It could always be the case that we discover some new part of physics that has intentionality, free will, and abstract components to it, and it was like, oh yeah, this now it can explain it. We couldn't explain it before because we just didn't know this about physics, and it's perfectly fine. So assuming that it's impossible to explain these things because our current conception of physics is unable to explain them is just conceptually not very strong, because like obviously we don't know everything. Like we don't even know, like, to put it in, to quote Thomas Edison, we only know 1/1,000,000 of 1% of anything. So saying that physics today can't conceptually explain this, therefore it's literally logically impossible to ever explain this with physics, just doesn't follow. So those would be my first two questions for Mike, is like, even if we granted that we couldn't explain these things with current materialism, why would you think this would apply to all possible materialism in the future that we haven't discovered yet? And why would saying that this is a fundamental essence of any kind be an answer to any of these questions?
Okay, so a couple things here. First of all, he says this new thing, appealing to the idea of conscious states or intentional states. But I wouldn't say that they're a new thing. I think that they're pretty ordinary, and that we experience them every day, and there's a consensus with all humans that we have intentional states. I don't think it's a new thing. But what TJump suggests here, that since materialism cannot show how conscious states, thought, free will, ethics, and general metaphysics emerged out of materialism, does not mean that dualism and or idealism can explain how they account for these phenomena either. Now, what we are seeing here is a conflation of how and that. The question isn't how dualism or idealism account for metaphysics, but rather that they can, whereas materialism conceptually cannot. TJump's argument that materiality explains these things is first granting that materiality is a fact in the world, but these worldviews are not things that are real. However, dualism and idealism reflect the fact that ideas, thoughts, feelings, as in conscious feels, are real things in the world. So for TJump to suggest that materiality is real, but ideas are not, is begging the question, in that he is assuming that thoughts are only epiphenomenal, but materiality are real properties in the world. However, we equally observe thoughts in the world as much as we do materiality. If thoughts and concepts are not in the world, then materiality cannot be either, if the metric is that it is not observed. Where we do not observe materiality, we observe empirical phenomena that we conceive as possessing material properties. He also states that there may be a time when we observe intentionality in materiality. However, by its very definition, materiality cannot possess these features, since matter only has weight and takes up space. It cannot possess qualitative features. Qualitative features categorize, they distinguish, they define the materiality we observe. Indeed, even number itself is a non-material feature that materiality must submit to in virtue of categorization and numbering. Consider that materialists must say that materiality is separate from numbers and qualities, even though they have no way of confirming this. Now, one strategy employed by materialists is that since all brains have an identical design, then they will simultaneously produce the same concepts, such as number, or the concept tree, like treeness. This concept of tree, not the empirical experience of a tree. However, the problem here is that meta-ontological presumptions of the structure of reality that do not have concepts would immediately negate, or one could say there would be a defeater for, the idea that our minds produce true statements about the nature of reality, since we are using concepts which materialists admits are only strategies of understanding the world, not really existing structures or categories in the world. And so even if naturalists were to demonstrate that Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism didn't show that our minds cannot produce true statements about reality, the fact that concepts cannot exist in the world outside the mind necessitates that our recognition of common design of our minds further necessitates that concepts exist really in the world to instantiate this commonality of design. And so our minds could not produce a true statement about the world because concepts cannot be merely in the mind to evaluate how material actually functions, since matter needn't conform to how our minds expect it to, since concepts are for our sake in a heuristic sense and not indicative of a really existing system that matter must adhere to. So, in other words, if materiality have these properties that when in connection to some sort of relationship, and a relationship assumes some sort of conceptual relationship, that they emerge, these ideas and concepts, well, that calls into question mind itself, because mind, that's what mind does. So a materialist from this perspective cannot account for this emergence except to say it just happens to do this. We observe before this, therefore because of this. We see neurons coming together before, afterwards. People claim they experience consciousness or conscious events, and if you do it to my brain, I will say I experience conscious events. But that's a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which is the idea that before this, therefore because of this, and there's really no connection to it being the cause, and that it is an emergent property. It's only emergentism in this sense is only identifying a cause where there is no cause. It's just trying to appeal to or trying to facilitate that particular materialist philosophy. It's trying to support it without any real evidence of the support other than to say, oh, it's an emergent. And this is a really poor cop-out. Now, let's hear where TJump talks a little bit more about the nature of matter. So let's hear what he has to say about the nature of matter and epistemic constraints on ontology. Let's listen a little bit here.
Starting to seem to be the end of the argument.
Well, yeah, so I disagree with that. That seems fairly obvious to me, is that when we say matter is quantifiable, that's an epistemic definition. We're defining it based off of how we see it, not how it is. So it doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of matter. And so even if it would be wrong to limit the capabilities of matter simply to how we see it, that would be like saying we can only see galaxies with telescopes, therefore galaxies are fundamentally made of telescopes. Like, obviously
Right.
not. Obviously, there's more to the galaxy than the fact that we can see it through telescopes. So the fact that consciousness, or the fact that matter can only be experienced through measurements, doesn't mean that that tells us everything about what matter fundamentally is. That just is our epistemic means to assess what it is, given our limitations. So that definition is simply giving primacy to our epistemic means and then not going beyond that.
Right. Well, I think in order to,
Which actually right here, he said going beyond our epistemic means. Well, for one, he has to show us how that's even possible to go beyond our epistemic means, and two, what he means by going beyond our epistemic means. What sort of supervening faculty can we appeal to, or some sort of faculty outside of our own faculty, which is epistemic and not meta-epistemic? How can we even talk about meta-epistemology without appealing to some sort of faculty which would enable us to think about thoughts? So that's a problem too. But let's hear what Dr. Egner has to say in response.
In order to claim that materialism is an adequate explanation for the mind, you necessarily have to go beyond epistemic means, because what we know now of the mind and of matter, it can't explain it in any way. So perhaps the explanation is indeed hidden in some unobservable ontological realm, and I wish you the best of luck with that. But the realm we live in now, which is the real world, matter cannot explain the mind in any sense.
All right, so I totally agree with you. I say that current materialism is not sufficient to.
Well, he just said current materialism. I think this is a mistake that Dr. Egner makes right here. He's saying our current understanding. What he needed to do was frame the issue in the way as to show that it's a categorical problem. It's not an observational problem where it's maybe down the road we're going to find the cause of this specific property in matter. No, matter by definition is something that cannot produce the sorts of qualities that we see in consciousness, the qualities we see in intentionality, the qualities we see in various metaphysical concepts and abstractions. So I think Dr. Egner is being far too generous here, and he needs to be firm and stick to his guns and stay his ground in that assertion that these sorts of categories as materiality are incapable categorically. And if you redefine the category of material or materiality, then it ceases to be materiality in the first place. And why can't we use language which sounds more like spiritual language or metaphysical spiritual language, which is exactly what we'd have to appeal to talk about thoughts and concepts and abstractions and consciousness itself. So let's hear what TJump has to say in that response.
To explain everything, I fully agree. But the reason this is an inductive argument, we can't fully explain anything. We again, Thomas Edison, we only know 1/millionth of 1% of anything. So why this is an inductive argument and a successful one is because we do have good reason to believe matter is real. We have no reason to believe consciousness is a fundamental thing at all. So it's like,
that's actually not true, because first of all, we have no empirical basis to state that materiality is true, right? Materiality is a concept we apply to certain features that we observe in the world. These are tactile features or features which reflect something that is eliciting something from our five senses or is appealing to something of our five senses. But we have more than that, right? We think, we infer, we intuit, we have a sense. As Kant had pointed out, we have several categories of thought and several categories of epistemic categories, such as time and space and all of these other things. So TJump is not really doing a good job of making a distinction between things we can know, which is materiality, and things we can't know, which is consciousness as a foundation. Because materiality needn't be a foundation. Materiality is a concept we've come up with to describe this panoply of, and a specific panoply, not all experience. So let's hear what he has to say. Continue on.
If I want to say what caused the footprint in the snow and I see nothing around, I see no animals anywhere around, I don't know what kind of animals live here, the best answer is to posit animals we already know exist at other points on the planet and not posit mythical beings like unicorns.
How do you know matter is right? How do you know matter is real? What is it in your experience that tells you it's real?
Novel testable predictions.
Through your mind.
Yes, through my mind.
Right. So it is your mind that through which you are able.
Now, this I don't understand how he can say that materiality is the cause of novel predictions, novel and testable predictions. Yes, we see phenomena exhibiting regular and predictable behavior, but how do we assign that to materiality? I don't know how he does that.
Able to see matter, to understand matter. So it would seem to me that the mind is a much more fundamental thing. That is, that you never see matter or understand matter except when you use your mind. So why would you think the mind is secondary rather than fundamental? It would seem to me, if anything, that matter is secondary, which in fact what idealists have argued.
If you notice, Josh is shaking his head yes, because this sounds really sensible, but TJump is committed to his materialism.
For centuries, and I think they kind of have a point. The one thing that we have direct access to is our mind. Everything else is indirect, including our knowledge of matter.
Sure. So our knowledge of other galaxies is indirect through telescopes. Does that mean that telescopes are more fundamental?
Now, here where he really goes off the rails when he says that our indirect knowledge of galaxies is based on telescopes. He's trying to use the analogy of a telescope as that of a mind. And he thinks that showing this will show that, or demonstrate that we don't assume that at base there's this telescopeness that the world must appeal to. Right? So let's see how he goes with this.
Until then, other galaxies? Well, obviously not. The fact that we can only see things through
the analogy here is our mind is not the telescope. Our mind is the astronomer looking through the telescope, and
right, but it applies the same way
immediately.
No. Also, too, this is a really poor analogy because we've created telescopes. We use them as a tool, and we can pull our eyeball away from the telescope and look at the world around us and compare the things we see through the telescope with the things that we see right now, so we can do a comparison. You can't do that with the mind. You can't pull away from the mind because the mind is the means by which we know, whereas the telescope is a tool to help us see things. So the telescope is not the eyeball. The telescope is an aid to help see things as an eyeball does. So really, ultimately, what we see here is that TJump suggests that the nature of matter reduced to the quantitative is an epistemic constraint, not an ontological one. He finds that this is merely how we know it, but it could function differently than we are capable of observing it. However, this begs the question and would therefore redefine what materiality is, and it may as well be consciousness or ideas. For we do experience or have epistemic access to intentionality that we observe in the world, which if matter possesses it, we can't observe it. But since we presume that intentionality is caused by the material, post hoc ergo propter hoc, as we talked about before, just because we find concomitant causes or causes that are alongside others, does not mean they are caused by the prior causes. I.e., example would be neurons. Just because neurons are being activated and they're actually there's activity going on and there's relationships being established with various neurons at the same time as conscious events are occurring, does not mean that the neurons are the cause of the consciousness. It just means like the consciousness and the neural relationships have some sort of relationship between them that we don't understand. Then we falsely assign materiality as the cause of the intentional, when the latter possesses no similar features to the former. In short, just because we observe neurons firing and then conscious states occurring does not mean the former causes the latter. It'd be more sensible to identify a relationship, but not a causal hierarchy. Indeed, it is just as possible that intentional states cause neurons, since according to the collapse of the wave function in a quantum mechanics that is generally precipitated by an intentional observation, then it would be just as reasonable to assume that an intentional observer is the cause of materiality, and not the other way around. So materiality itself could be the cause of intentionality and not the other way around. As to TJump, his instance here that the mind is not fundamental any more than telescopes are fundamental understanding galaxies, it is observing. Offers, as I said, a poor analogy in that unlike telescopes, we can simply move away from it and observe the telescope itself. We cannot get outside of our minds to observe the mind itself, for the mind is the means by which we know things. To use the mind to know the mind is a contradiction. Egner suggests that mind is not a means of knowing, but is knowing. However, a better example is appeal to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, to where one would have to step outside the circle of knowing to observe how we know. We can't do this. If we are observing the means by which we know, by using the means by which we know, it seems quite obvious that we would reach false conclusions just as one is observing the inside of a house to tell us what the outside looks like. And so either the mind is not the means by which we know, as Egner suggests, and is just knowledge itself, or something or someone else is elevating human knowledge to a level that it itself cannot achieve, which is something like divine revelation, which is not a natural process that, if each entity is reduced to its own abilities, cannot account for this. All right, so right here, I think TJump's going off the rails with this poor analogy of consciousness. Let's hear what he says a little bit about emergent properties. So he talks a little bit about emergent properties. So let's listen to a little bit here.
Okay, all right, good.
So in your
Um,
analogy,
yeah.
in your analogy, the consciousness could be a process that is an emergent property of other non-conscious things. So the consciousness was a tool built by non-conscious things, and then it did the experiment. So it's not fundamental. And that would be perfectly consistent.
What do you mean by emergent?
Like hearts are emergent, lungs, organs,
No, no, no. I
walls,
no, no.
suns.
I want a definite. No, no. I want a
Oh,
definition, not examples.
new properties that are a result of combinations of things that none of which have those new properties.
So new properties that come from nothing. How do they get
No,
the new
new
property?
properties that come from other things that
Where
exist,
do the new properties come from?
from other things that exist that don't have those properties.
So how can something that doesn't have properties give other things properties? Where do they get it from?
That's what emergent properties are.
Yeah, there's another word for emergence as you're using it, and that's magic. What you're really saying is that these properties sort of magically come out of things. Emergence is a very, very weak concept. And what emergence basically means is that a collection of lesser entities sometimes manifests behavior on a large scale that is not predictable from the behavior of the entities on the individual scale. But that's a psychological phenomenon, meaning that what it means is that emergence is kind of a surprise. A very good example is if you understand the physics of water molecules. That doesn't really tell you that water feels wet when you actually feel it. So you can say, well, wetness is an emergent property of water, which is true. I mean, that's a common example of emergence. When you look at emergence carefully, though, it's a psychological phenomenon. That is, you don't expect it, but it happens. So emergence presupposes a mind. So emergence
Nope.
can't be an explanation for a mind.
Nope. Emergence is specifically a bunch of essentially particles being affected by one force, but when they conglomerate into a larger collection, they're affected by another force that had a less of effect. And so the second force supersedes the first force. So like if you have a hydrogen atom, it's affected by the strong and weak electromagnetic force, not really affected by gravity that much. If you put a whole bunch of hydrogen atoms together, then gravity starts to overtake the strong and weak electromagnetic forces to apply a new feature, which it becomes a star. And so you have an emergent property of star because the conglomeration of the past thing causes it to be taken over by a new force that was not as prevalent or not as prevalent as the previous.
If you notice right here, one thing that TJump's doing, he's conflating physical fields, physical measurements, physical forces, for example, with particles, and he's not addressing the real problem, which is how do these qualities emerge from mere motion. He's talking about forces, he's talking about amplitude, he's talking about waves, he's talking about fields. And all of these things are nothing but physical phenomena. These are physical phenomena that are affecting each other in a measurable way. But they don't have qualities, and he's not explaining how the qualities emerge. This can explain how one particle or one wave is affected by another particle or wave in a particular field, in a particular state. But it's not telling us anything about how qualities emerge. And Michael Egner right here is quite correct in describing this as magic. As we'll see later with Bernard Kastrup, he explicitly states as well that emergentism, as explained by most materialists, is a form of magical thinking. But let's see.
Previous force, which then has a new effect. None of this is subjective. This is all about things interacting in reality, of combining in such a way that a new force takes over from an old force. Essentially, it has nothing to do with subjective experience here.
Yeah, emergence is a psychological phenomenon, and it basically is being surprised things act in the aggregate compared to what we know of how things act in the particular. So you can't explain the mind using a psychological property. If there's
So
no
I just proved that
mind,
false.
Actually, he didn't prove it false, but all he did was just sidestep the issue. I think Egner right here probably should have pointed out how there's a difference between quantities and qualities, and that there aren't any qualitative or there's no evidence as to how qualities can emerge from quantitative fields and quantitative behaviors of matter. So materiality is nothing but quantitative, quantitative sort of properties. And Egner's pointing out that these qualitative properties, it's not evident how they can just sort of pop out of nowhere. And TJump just seems to be sidestepping it. And he's telling us just basically the quantitative effect of one particle or wave to another. But this is not telling us how these qualities emerge. And I think he's naively and very superficially sidestepping this really serious problem that we have in philosophy and in the science of philosophy, or the philosophy of science. And I think he's being disingenuous to his audience by suggesting that it's just quite simple. It's not simple, TJump, and I think you're being very very disingenuous, and you're just not. It's just not true what he's saying. All right, so let's go to the next. Okay, let's go to the next here. So we see TJump kind of gaslighting Dr. Egner. So it's a little bit this. I mean, TJump's not bad, but he's not an academic. So because he's not an academic, he is not able to think outside of his own way of seeing the world. Most academics can, and they can see other points of view and see them as equally as rational as their own, even though they're more convinced in one way or another. And that's the earmark of a true scholar. Someone who's non-scholarly and is dogmatic, which would be the similarity of a street preacher, would be someone like a fundamentalist atheist or materialist like TJump, who sees only one position, and that position must be true. And if you don't think it's true, then you're just dumb, you're stupid, or you have a really, you just don't understand the situation. And that's just, he'll continue to say, you just don't understand physics, you just don't understand philosophy, you just don't understand. When in reality, people who really understand these issues are going to see that there is an area for divergence of thought. And there's many branches of thought on this. So let's hear what he has to say right here.
In which a concept of a triangle cannot.
By the way, he's talking about concepts, and TJump here has a specific view of concepts, and he feels that concepts are only mental images in the mind, and that they cannot be anything else. So let's see what he says.
Not be an image, because there are no perfect triangles in images, but there are perfect triangles in concepts.
So again, the concept is of the general shape, and then we add another concept of specific measurements, and those two concepts give you triangle. So triangle is literally an image. It's a mental image.
No, an image is in this context is something visible, and there's no visible line that's perfectly straight. There's no,
it doesn't need to be
sum of internal angles. Yes, it does, because the concept of a triangle is three.
I think you just don't understand how concepts work.
See, and when he says you don't understand how concepts work, actually TJump doesn't understand the debate within the philosophy of concepts, which there are several different views, and they're all equally compelling. Now, one is his view that concepts are mapped onto to mental images, but there are other ones. There are other ones where we're looking at abstractions, where concepts reflect certain sort of non-imaging principles that kind of come together, and we can't really map onto a particular image that we have in our mind, but nevertheless, they exist. So here we see the pinnacle of TJump's gaslighting by suggesting a neurosurgeon doesn't understand what concepts are. He literally tells this guy, Michael Egner, he doesn't know what concepts are. Here, TJump defends a position of concepts as mental representations. However, he does so as if this is the only position that scientists, philosophers, etc. hold. However, we look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, we see two other positions. One which seems close to what Egner's defending, which is concepts as abilities. This is a position that is held by many in various fields of neuroscience, philosophy, etc. But TJump insists that concepts must be mental images and their ambiguation. However, he demonstrates that the weakness of this position by continually referencing relationships between images, which themselves cannot be an image themselves, right? They can't be images themselves. A relationship cannot be an image itself. So by his appeal to the language of how these relationships occur, he's demonstrating that one doesn't have an image of a relationship, even though we understand what relationships are, and they are conceptual understanding. So one cannot imagine an image of relationships. So if TJump were intellectually honest, he would grant to Egner this possibility, but he just simply states that according to his position, he doesn't even say his position. He says this is true. He's not willing to give any nuance to this position. The most compelling view is his. He gaslights Egner into thinking this is the only position held by all experts in all fields related to researching concepts, as if one can research concepts and whether one develops a consistent model, theory, etc., and all that. So right here, I think Mike is having trouble with TJump because he's used to speaking with academics, and TJump is not an academic. I mean, he's clearly well-read in his sort of echo chamber of what he thinks a concept is. I mean, he seems to know a lot about philosophy that kind of services his perspective or view, but he doesn't know very much on the other side, and he assumes that that is the only view. And this is a very dangerous thing to do in philosophy. So ultimately, when listening to T-Jump's version of materialism, to where he merely defined anything empirically experienced as being material, it made me think of the dimensions of materiality, which is nothing more than weight and space. However, if we think of this definition, we can equate it with the idea of a two-dimensional plane, to where the materialist who states that they will in the future discover the qualities, which are three-dimensional qualities, on a two-dimensional plane, is confusing categories with problems to solve given time. No matter how far you run along the two-dimensional plane, you will and can never discover depth, as is the case with materialism by definition. The qualities we see in the world are of depth of the spirit, not of weight and space. So this is a categorical error. This is not an error, empirical error that we just haven't discovered yet. So, however, when he talks to Bernardo Kastrup, which explains, so let's cue up his video with Bastrup. He explains it. So he has a little bit of more of an open view of consciousness, fundamental in that. Okay, so let's listen to a little bit of this conversation with Bernardo Kastrup. We'll listen to a little bit right here.
This mistake is costing Amazon Prime shoppers billions. Are you still using Prime? Because
as an idealist would just say, well, there is something out there. Experience.
Okay. Let's see. I really like Bernardo's definition of materialism, or of idealism and materialism.
I think it's a much more parsimonious position, which doesn't incur into the...
He's talking about idealism. He thinks it's more parsimonious, and this is why.
Insoluble problems of materialism, like the so-called the hard problem of consciousness. Materialists cannot find a way, not even in principle, to deduce the qualities of experience, like what it is like to taste a strawberry or to have a bellyache, to deduce these qualities from the quantitative parameters that characterize, for instance, our brains. There's nothing about the material brain in terms of which we could deduce our inner experience. And I think they incur that problem because they invent this category called matter outside and independent of mind, and then they try to reduce themselves to it, which is impossible. It's like a dog chasing its own tail. So I think the explanatory power of materialism and the logical consistency, the parsimony, is much superior, because an idealist would just say, well, there is something out there, all right, but it is mental as well. And it appears from our perspective in the form that we call matter, just like my brain appears to you in the form that you call matter. But my brain, in my view, is just the way my inner experience looks like from a second or third person perspective. And I think the same goes for the inanimate universe. the matter in the inanimate universe is just what transpersonal mental states look like when we observe them.
You mentioned the hard problem of consciousness, and you said that it's an intractable problem that materials can't solve. But it seems like, from my perspective, all the idealist is doing is, well, just saying, well, we can't reduce it. We're just going to claim it's a fundamental thing in and of itself. And it seems like materialists could do that too, and just claim that consciousness is just a material thing. But it seems more like the CD sound problem, where if you put a CD in a computer, listening to the sound that comes out of your speakers, you could never reverse engineer what's on the CD until you actually know the programming language of the computer and then how it's read on a CD. And so there's no combination of things that could be on the sound that you listen to from the music that you could use to reverse engineer the CD. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to go from the sound to the CD. And the same could be true of conscious experience. The fact that
of course it's
These are those rhombohedron crystals in your pineal gland. When those crystals become electrically
Sorry about that.
It's entirely possible to go from the sound to the CD if you define sound not at the experience you have when you listen to it, but if you define sound as the patterns of pressure oscillations in the air, which is what it is from a materialist perspective, you can surely reduce that to your CD, to the grooves that you see on your CD, if you would amplify that, to the mechanisms, the electronic mechanisms in the CD, to the speaker. It's entirely reducible. What is not reducible is when you say, the melody I hear and I experience, I cannot reduce that to the CD and the sound system, which is the problem of materialism, I agree, yeah.
Well, the analogy I'm trying to draw is that if before you knew how a computer worked, and you heard sound from a speaker, like if we got somebody from the 1700s and we put them in front of a computer and we take a CD and say, there's music on this CD and we're going to put it into a computer and they're going to listen to it, there's no way that they can listen to the sound and then know what's happening on the CD. It would be impossible for them because they don't have the framework to understand all of how that works, just like how we don't have the framework to understand how the brain works right now. But it doesn't follow that it's impossible to do that. Like if we could potentially draw a connection between how conscious experience works and the brain, then it would actually potentially be possible to bridge that gap of the hard problem.
So let me just break in right here. We're going to get kind of past this, but basically here when he talks to Bernard Kastrup, he explains that consciousness is fundamental, or Bernard does. That consciousness, and that how he explains this. Now in this little exchange, they're talking about how you can reproduce sound. So what TJump is trying to argue is that sound is nothing but this material sort of phenomenon that can be reduced to something that's kind of recorded on a CD. What Bernard is explaining is that you actually can can show that it's distinct from the grooves on the CD, the sound, the pressure, and all that goes through our eardrums. That's the quantitative, right? That's the material. But at base, there's this thing called a song, a tune, and these things are not emergent properties, but rather the other way around. That the materiality is the material instantiation of ideas or concepts or experiences, conscious experiences, which is what he calls a dissociative process. He goes even further and talks about how when a child is born, for example, and you observe a child developing, let's say in a mother's womb, there's a point at which we can observe consciousness in the child. Before that, TJump would say, well, see right there, before it has consciousness, you have a material substrate that is causing the consciousness to emerge. But what Kastrup is telling us, Dr. Kastrup, he's explaining that no, actually the material substrate is actually the dissociative instantiation of universal consciousness disassociating itself. So whenever, and Kastrup explains this, how in psychology you can have one particular personality and it can branch off into other personalities. One person can have several personalities. And he's saying that the universe is kind of like this. It branches off and it disassociates itself from itself. And when it does that, there's a wall between each personality or each different individual within the whole of consciousness. And that wall is what we would call materiality. It's the instantiated, dissociative break between each one. And he talks about when a child is born, the appearance from non-consciousness to consciousness is not the emergence of new properties due to material things, but rather an emergence of the dissociative process of universal consciousness breaking away. Every single material thing is a part of universal consciousness, and biological parts of a dissociative process from the universal consciousness. And the material we observe is the wall between each dissociative process, one from another. Now, TJump will later on, and we're going to go to that here in a sec, will later on argue for emergentism and even argue that emergentism doesn't even have to be restricted to biological processes that we see in neurons, that you can actually, you can actually recreate consciousness even in silicon, even in, this is the crazy part, even in pipes and water pressure. So if you have a if you have a complex and large enough a large enough complex of pipes with pressure valves and water, if you have one that mirrors the neural processes of what we see as consciousness, and which would be about the size of a planet if you were to actually recreate something like this, because that's all basically a neural sort of connection relationships are, you would have consciousness. So TJump is under the assumption that you could have emergent consciousness from a series of pipes and water, which is where we get into the area of the absurd. So let's hear where he talks a little bit about pipes being the cause of consciousness.
Of the different pressures in the different valves producing and interacting with each other to create different kinds of complicated computational systems, and that's all consciousness is, as far as I can tell. It's just like we have a visual cortex, which I'm not sure how you perceive the different parts of the brain and how they function and what we visualize, but we know we have a visual cortex, and that's what does the vision stuff in our brain. We have a auditory areas like the Broca's area and Wicked's area, and the dorsal and ventral streams of the brain, and different parts of the brain do different things. And the reason that different parts of the brain do different things is because they're different combinations of those pipes and the pressure valves. And so I think that the consciousness as a whole is, again, just another one of those pipes and pressure valves things.
But, okay, back to the analogy I made earlier. Would adding more speakers to a hi-fi system ever allow the hi-fi system to produce an image like a television?
Actually, yes, because you can take high enough vibrations of sound, and if you vibrate like a piece of metal that has sand on it, it'll produce an image. So if you essentially have enough of those things, like if you have enough of those sound speakers or whatever that produces essentially a metal plate with sand on it, you can produce an image. And so, yes, it is technically possible that sound can produce an image.
I think you're abusing my my metaphor. The point I'm trying to make is that image and sound are two incommensurable things. That's why you have eyes and ears and not the same organ system to pick up on both. And adding complexity in one of these spaces, the space of sound, will never allow you to create something in the space of images. It just creates more complex sound. And you can go in that direction ad infinitum, and you will have infinitely complex sound, but you not have an image. Maybe my sense of plausibility is different than yours, but to me, I cannot imagine adding enough pipes and pressure valves to have a system consisting of pipes and pressure valves and water magically have inner life.
Well, let's go with your sound example again. Like, if you produce enough sound with enough energy behind it, it will in fact separate the electrons from the atom, and then it will create light. So you can actually create images if you produce enough sound. It'll just take a whole bunch of sound.
the analogy has a limit. I'm trying to illustrate incommensurability with the analogy between sound and light.
Oh, absolutely. I totally understand what you're going for here, but my argument is that just in the same sense that you can stretch the analogy and go to, if you add enough sound, you could produce light indirectly. I think the same thing could apply to consciousness too.
No, because the very way you have reasoned about this means that there is a way, in principle, to deduce the emergent properties from the properties of the constituent systems, the constituent components. In other words, there is a way to deduce the images from the sound, so to say.
This game, you're not ready.
Because that's exactly what you're saying. You're saying, I can, in principle, conceive of a reasonable way to deduce the emergent property from the constituent systems, from the speakers or the pipes and valves. But the heart of the very problem is that the statement that you can do that for everything that we call weakly emergent properties, like sand dunes. Sand dunes are an emergent property of sand grains and wind.
Yep.
But you can deduce sand dunes from the properties of sand grains and wind. Actually, you can run a simulation on your computer, and you have the sand dunes forming and moving. You can deduce the shape of a snowflake from the properties of water molecules. You can simulate that on your computer, and you see that at certain temperatures, the molecules would tend to arrange them. Certain temperatures and pressures, the molecules will arrange themselves in that way, producing the emergent property that we call the shape of a snowflake. In all these cases, you can deduce the emergent property from the system components. But the claim of the hard problem and the challenge of the hard problem is that consciousness is not weakly emergent. It's strongly emergent, which is a code for we have no idea how it happens, because nobody has put forward a rationale for deducing the qualities of experience, at least in principle, from the characteristics of the components of the system, in this case, the molecules that make up your brain.
So what Bernardo is telling us is that that when you have the constituents that make up consciousness, you cannot deduce based on the constituents themselves. And even the relationship between the constituents, you can't deduce from them consciousness. If, for example, we existed in a non-conscious world and we were observing, which is impossible to do without consciousness, obviously, but let's just say hypothetically, which seems hard to think about that hypothetically, we were able to observe the particles that make up consciousness and the relationships between them that make up consciousness. We could never deduce consciousness itself. We could never figure out what it's like to experience red, for example. If we knew the constituent neural patterns in the brain that are related to what it's like or what we feel like when we see red, there's no way if we were to look at them or observe them in isolation from the emergent phenomena of consciousness, we could never deduce that. So what that suggests is that the phenomena of consciousness is not caused by or merged from those constituent parts, because there's no way, in principle, even ideally, we could even. It's not that we haven't discovered it yet. See, TJump keeps thinking we haven't discovered it yet, but we could. What Bernardo is saying, we can't even conceive of a way of deducing it. It's not so much that we haven't got to the point empirically where we discovered this relationship between neurons and consciousness. We can't even conceive of it. And again, that goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the 2 and 3-dimensional planes. It's trying to deduce depth from a 2-dimensional plane. You can't do it. So what Bernardo says is a much better model for reality is, instead of coming from reality and assuming matter first, why don't we just assume consciousness first? Right. So, and that obviously makes a lot more sense. So ultimately, he believes that if you have a complex enough system of pipes with the exact same sort of processes as replicated by what goes on in the brain, that consciousness would emerge magically. This is another annoying habit of these so-called, what I would call armchair scientists, when they try to say scientists with the whole we know that consciousness emerges from brain states, or we observe that through these processes X happens. It's like, no, you don't. You do not participate in these experiments. It is they, not we. So that's kind of another annoying practice I see from a lot of armchair scientists who say, we know this, we know that. No, the scientists are the ones who know that, and you're speaking from a position of appealing to authority. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not trying to call that a fallacy. I'm just saying that's the case. So, and I think you should listen to this whole conversation. It's probably one of the best, probably the best TJump's probably had. It's a really good one, actually. And it ends on a congenial note, which I like. I don't like confrontation. Well, not confrontation. I don't like combative, hateful speech. I like when it's civil. So, see, Bernardo in this, though, he expresses his view that he is naturalist. And he explains naturalism as the unfolding of nature. So, let's watch a little bit of a discussion with Graham Oppy. So, in this, Bernardo is talking with Graham Oppy about materialism. He has a different view. Well, I mean, he has the same view, but I think we get to understand a little bit more about what's going on with him.
Tulip
So
is
let's
helping manufacturers reimagine their tech
I
stack.
hate these stupid
But
things.
don't just take our word for it.
Okay, so let's find. Oh gosh, that's loud.
Is constituted out
Okay,
of
so
natural
that's
stuff.
this is
The natural
let's hear what
what would be the
Bernardo
key
says.
difference in terms of how you're understanding idealism between your view and like an idealist position then?
Okay,
Oh,
so
that's
for
Oppy. So let's hear what
idealists, the way that I understand.
To me, naturalism, and to most philosophers I know, naturalism is the notion that what exists is natural. So we are only excluding supernaturalism, which basically doesn't exclude any serious person or position engaged in this debate. So for me, naturalism is it's the idea that nature unfolds spontaneously according to the patterns and regularities we call the laws of physics, and that there isn't a anthropomorphic entity that interferes in the normal, ordinary unfolding of nature on a whim, in a deliberate way, that nature unfolds spontaneously according to its own patterns and regularities. So from this perspective, I'm absolutely a naturalist. I'm not a supernaturalist at all. To me, the difference between what we might call mainstream physicalism and analytic idealism, there are many forms of physicalism, some of which don't really deserve the term physicalism because they have become so abstract that there is nothing physical left in the reduction base. So mainstream physicalism is the notion that at the bottom level of reality, there are physical entities, be them elementary subatomic particles or abstract fields, and that mind somehow emerges out of particular arrangements of physical entities as a byproduct thereof. Analytic idealism states that at the bottom level of reality, there is a field of subjectivity, of simple subjectivity, and excitations of this field are what we call experiences, and that's the bottom level of reality. What we colloquially call the material world, which the idealist will not deny. But for the idealist, the material world is what transpersonal mental processes look like when observed from our perspective, or technically when observed from across a dissociative boundary. So
now this is where he I like his views on idealism, but I will push back a little bit on his view because he calls himself an analytic idealist, which seems to suggest that ideas or fields of consciousness behave in a regular sort of pattern, and we can observe this regular pattern just the same way we can observe fields of physical things, right? Fields of physical things, which would be like, amplitude, waves, particles, and things like that. The same way we observe those, we can observe these conscious fields, which I had to push back on that because consciousness, it doesn't work that way. So he expresses a view that he is a naturalist and explains naturalism as the unfolding of nature. And he excludes supernaturalism, which does not include any serious person in the debate, in a spontaneous way according to the regularities and patterns we call the laws of physics, and that there isn't any an anthropomorphic figure that interferes with the normal unfolding of nature on a whim. So he claims he's a naturalist, which makes a distinction between mainstream physicalism and analytic idealism, which the latter he regards as undeserving of the term physicalism, since the term lacks anything physical in its foundation, as in anything observed in nature is physical. He states that for analytic idealism at base, there is a field of subjectivity at the bottom of everything. Excitations of this subjectivity is what we call experiences. For this sort of idealist, which is known as, or colloquially known as, the material world, is what transfer mental processes and what, from our perspective, they look like the material. When we observe from across a dissociative boundary, so the physical is an appearance of an image, not the thing in itself. The physical does not have a standalone reality. Now, my problem with Kastrup's view is his association with analytic philosophy and its appeal to grounding definitions and terms of reality in these natural kinds, or terms and kinds, which are scientifically established rather than established in the humanities, in the ordinary way in which we understand the development of terms and definitions. We do not use science to understand the world. We use it to understand the nature of physical processes. A stronger position would be we use science predicated on terms found in the humanities to manipulate the physical environment. Also, his view that subjectivity is a field rather than a person is assuming that personhood emerges from this dissociative process as a result of these fields. But subjectivity and will or intentionality, I would argue, are synonymous. And what we mean by personhood is a feature of intentionality. For to be subjective is to be subject object thingness to one. Is to subject objects to thingness to one. So in other words, subjective is to subject objects to us and not treating subjects as objects, as we treat objects, as things that we observe, things that we measure, things that we subject to critical analysis and rigor. Rather, a subject is the thing that does the rigorous measurements and things like that. So to reduce subjectivity to something we're observing is to not be able to treat it in its true purview or sense. He seems to be treating subjectivity as an object, which to me seems counterintuitive. He seems to so quick to rescue mind from matter, he forgets to rescue the subject from the objectification. So he finds that mind is a fundamental thing that we need to rescue from physicalism. But in doing so, he forgets to rescue subjectivity itself from objectification and objectifying the subject. I would also state that nature is simply the instantiation of chosen or willed actions that establish patterns rather than the other way around, to where will is an instantiation of the nature of the subjective, a byproduct of subjectivity's disassociation. And I think that Kastrup maybe could maybe appeal to some of the pragmatist philosophers who would push back against the understanding of a law. As opposed to a law is nothing more than a habit of an agent. An agent typically makes this assertion, makes this willed action, and it continually does it. And when you continually do that, you have a pattern, which is a habit. Now, that habit doesn't mean you always have to do that. For example, it very well may be the case that every morning I wake up at 6 a.m. and I do this and that, and then I go to work at 9. That's a habit of mine, but I don't have to do that. A law says I have to do that. A habit is a recognition that I normally do a certain thing because that's what I choose to do every day. But when you put a law on a will, and you say you have to do this, or a field of consciousness or a field of subjectivity has to behave in a certain way and has to disassociate itself in this particular way, then you're actually putting the cart before the horse. The law is instantiated or caused by the willful actions of an agent that performs certain tasks and wills certain things and makes and creates those functional laws based on their actions, and it's not the other way around. So those are just some things I would say. So I think that Bernardo Kastrup has some great things to say about idealism. I think he had a great conversation with TJump. I think if Dr. Egner, in the earlier conversation with TJump, had appealed to some of the more obvious distinctions between idealism and materialism, and the subject-object distinction, I think he would have probably performed a little better against it. But I think TJump was not as nuanced in his views because of his lack of scholarly understanding of the field of philosophy, and he doesn't understand that there are many different views on concepts, and there's many different views on the nature of reality, and he seemed to be too quick to recognize that, too quick to suggest that this is the only rational way that we can understand reality. But there are many other ways that are rationally acceptable, and he just is more convinced by another. And that's fine. And that may have to do with psychology. Maybe he's just the type of person that is more gravitates more toward mechanistic functions rather than choices and psychological states that appeal to someone who really likes to talk to people, really likes to get involved with people as opposed to things. Sometimes that may have a bearing on the type of presuppositions and worldviews that we adopt. So then that's fine, but it's important that that these people understand that there's a large field of study in philosophy and in science, and you don't have to just stick with one. So that's what I would say on those debates. I think they were great, and I will see you guys next time. Great talking with you.